Welcome back to the Disturbed Chronicles. My name's Cams, and I'm glad you're here because today's video we're going to take a look into California and their most notorious serial killers. Now, California has long been known as the birthplace to some of the most infamous serial killers in history, and some contribute that to the vast population, which stands at over 42 million as of 2025. I currently am from Georgia, and our population is just over 11 million. So California leads the nation with over 1,777 known serial killers. That's a lot, which it majorly exceeds Texas and Florida, which they're just under 1,000. So today we're going to discuss some of those, and we're going to start with Joseph James DeAngelo, also known as the Golden State Killer. He murdered at least 13 people, and he committed over 50 assaults and at least 120 robberies between 1974 and 1986. And he had a total of over 48 victims. That's a lot of people, guys. That is a lot of victims, more than the average serial killer. Joseph was actually an ex-police officer, and his victims' age ranges from 12 to 41. And he was known for stalking his victims, breaking into their homes and waking them up with a flashlight and a handgun, and he would brutally assault them. He would usually force the women to tie up their partners, and then he would bound the women. After that, he would often stack the dishes on top of these men's backs, and he would threaten, to kill everybody in the house if he heard those dishes move. He would abuse these women repeatedly, and reports say that during the abuse, he would repeat, "I hate you, Bonnie," which was his ex-fiancée. DeAngelo would spend hours inside of these people's homes, often eating their food and drinking beer, making himself really at home. And he was able to evade capture for decades due to his methodical approach and the lack of DNA evidence at the time. I think a lot of that probably contributed to his experience with law enforcement, considering he was an ex-police officer. And it wasn't until 2018, when investigators used genealogy database, that DeAngelo was actually identified as the prime suspect of these murders. He was arrested and later pleaded guilty to all charges in 2020, bringing some sense of justice and a little bit of closure to the victims' families. This is fairly recent, 2020 is only 5 years ago. He was charged with multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. A statement from him in the interrogation room reads, "I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. It was like it was in my head. I mean, he was a part of me. I didn't want to do the things. I pushed Jerry out. And I had a happy life. I did all those things. I destroyed all of their lives, so now I have to pay the price." Because of his old age, they didn't give him the death sentence because they knew that he would probably die before he was ever executed. This man was nearly 74 years old, and his case became one of the most high-profile examples of how genealogy can be used to solve cold cases. And he's still in prison today. So the next one we're going to talk about is Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. Some of you may have heard of him because they actually have a Netflix documentary or TV show that you can watch. I've not seen it myself, but if you're more interested, you can definitely take a look at that. He killed over 13 people between 1984 and 1985, spreading terror across the state of California with his satanic rituals in a very short span of time, just 1 year. His victims aged ranged from 8 to 83 years old. Very young and very old women he would like to take advantage of. Ramirez had a very troubling childhood, which reports say is why he became such a violent person. Ramirez's cousin was actually an ex-war veteran, and he would tell him stories about him abusing young women and torturing them and killing them when he was back in the war. Ramirez was actually a witness to his cousin killing his own wife, and shortly after that, Ramirez started to break into homes, and he actually dropped out of high school. Ramirez reportedly liked to use guns and machetes, tire irons, and claw hammers on his victims. He often strangled them with his bare hands using ligatures that he brought with him or that he found on the scene. He even stomped one of his victims to death in their own bed, and he tortured one of his victims with live electrical cords. He was very, very brutal. He enjoyed humiliating his victims, degrading them, and sometimes he even painted or used their lipstick to draw satanic symbols on the walls of their homes. And now all of his surviving victims said that he had rancid breath and really bad teeth, which this helped the police actually narrow down a sketch of Ramirez, and it helped them find him and figure out who he was whenever they saw him out in public, because his teeth were kind of undeniable. He was convicted in 1989 of all 43 charges against him, and the judge stated that the cruelty and the callousness and the viciousness of his crimes were beyond any human understanding. He was sentenced to death by gas chamber. He spent more than 2 decades on death row before dying from complications of cancer back in June of 2013. He was 53 years old. Yeah, he was one of the most brutal killers, but not as brutal as Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is also known as the co-ed killer. He murdered 10 people, including his own grandparents and his mother. Yeah, it's a really, really sick psycho man that could kill his own mother. He also killed several young women between the early 1970s. His youngest victim was just 15 years old, and he was just 15 years old when he first killed his grandmother and his grandfather. He said he just wanted to know what it was like to kill grandma. And shortly after he killed his grandmother, he killed his grandfather because he knew that his grandfather would be upset about him killing his grandma. Evidently, Edmund felt rejected by his parents, and especially his mother, and that's why he had to spend so much time with his grandparents. He was very smart. He had an IQ of over 140, so he wasn't your typical sociopath. A lot of serial killers actually have a high intelligence. They're not dumb. He liked to pick up young female hitchhikers, and then he would take them to secluded areas. He would shoot, stab, or strangle them to death. And then he would take the bodies home with him, and he would do horrendous, unspeakable things to his body. I actually learned a new term while reading about this man. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's called iramation. And if you don't know what it is, look it up, because I didn't even know they had a definition for something like that. He actually performed iramation after he decapitated his victims and then dismembering their bodies. Edmund's hatred for his mother was in direct relation to why he liked to do these things to younger women, and he used them as surrogates to take out his anger. Edmund eventually acted on that anger, and he bludgeoned his own mother to death while she was asleep and then decapitated her, as he did to most of his victims. This one was a little different. He took her head and placed it on a shelf and then screamed at the head for hours. Shortly after this, he took out her vocal cords and her tongue and then shoved it down the garbage disposal. He also later on went to a bar nearby, met his mother's best friend, brought her back to the house, and then killed her. When questioned in an interview as to why he decapitated his victims, This was what he said. The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything is at. The brain, the eyes, the mouth. That's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left to a girl's body without the head. Only a psychopath could say something like this, right? Edmund actually turned himself in not long after he murdered his mother. He called the police from a payphone and confessed to his crimes. The police later came and picked him up, and they asked him why he confessed. Edmund stated that his purpose was gone, and the feelings and the weight of things started to actually weigh on him. He tried to unalive himself several times before his trial. He tried to convince the jury that he was insane, but eventually was found guilty. Edmund asked for the death penalty and requested death by torture. Instead, he received 7 years to life for each count, and he spent the last 51 years incarcerated and is currently being held at a psychiatric center. He has been denied parole several times, and the most recent denial of parole was just last year in 2014 after he was labeled high risk to offend. Edmund is currently wheelchair bound and suffers from diabetes and coronary heart disease. So it sounds like maybe he is getting the death by torture that he requested. And last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about the Zodiac Killer. Now, a lot of you may have heard about him. He has at least 7 confirmed victims, and he remains one of the most elusive serial killers in America's history. He was active in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and he is confirmed to have at least 5 victims in the Northern California. He targeted young couples in secluded areas, shooting or stabbing them. His attacks didn't last long, and he usually carried out these murders within 2 to 3 minutes. What set him apart was his habit of taunting the police and the media with cryptic letters and ciphers, and some which have never been solved till this day. Some would start off by him saying, "This is the Zodiac Killer," and he would threaten killing sprees and bombings if his letters weren't printed in the paper. The Zodiac Killer confirmed that he had killed at least 37 people in his last letter, although the police say that he has only killed at least 7. His identity is still unknown despite the numerous investigations, and the only suspect that was ever named was Arthur Lee Allen, which was a former elementary school teacher, and he was a convicted offender, but he died back in 1992. The San Francisco Police Department marked this case inactive in 2004, but they reopened it back in 2007. The case still remains open with the FBI till this day. So needless to say, these killers definitely left their marks on the Golden State, and it just goes to show you never know what's lurking beneath the surface. So that's what I have for you guys today. And if you enjoyed this video, please let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you guys on the next disturbing video.